compel us to go on living. The second alternative is to face the absurdity of life and to live bravely. Atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell said, for example, that only upon the firm foundation of unyielding despair can the soul's habitation be henceforth safely built. Camus said that we should simply recognize the absurdity of life and then live in love for one another. But the problem with this alternative is that it is impossible to live consistently and happily within the framework of such a worldview. Man cannot live as though life had no meaning, value, and purpose. And so what people subconsciously do is to assume that their lives have meaning, value, and purpose, even though they have no right to, since modern man does not believe in God. And what I'd like to do is to look again at each of those three areas in which we saw that life is absurd without God, and to show how modern man fails to live consistently and happily within this worldview. First, the area of meaning. We saw that without God, life is ultimately meaningless. And yet philosophers continue to live as though life does have meaning. For example, Jean-Paul Sartre argued that one may create meaning for his life by freely choosing some course of action. Sartre himself chose Marxism. Now, this program is utterly inconsistent. It is inconsistent to say on the one hand that life is absurd, and then to say on the other hand that one may create meaning for his life. For if life is objectively absurd, then man is trapped. Without God, there can be no objective meaning in life. Sartre's program is actually an exercise in self-delusion. For the universe doesn't really acquire a meaning just because I happen to give it one. And I think this is obvious. For suppose you give the universe one meaning and I give it another. Who's right? Well, I think the obvious answer is neither one. For the universe in and of itself remains intrinsically meaningless, regardless of how we happen to regard it. Sartre is really saying, let's pretend that the universe has meaning. And this is just fooling yourself. The point is this: if God does not exist, then life is objectively meaningless. But mankind cannot live consistently and happily as though life were meaningless. And so in order to be happy, he invents certain purposes and projects for life, and he pretends that these invest his life with meaning. But this is, of course, entirely inconsistent. For without God, man and the universe are ultimately without significance. Turn next to the problem of value. This is where the most blatant inconsistencies occur. First of all, atheistic humanists are totally inconsistent in holding to the values of human love and brotherhood. Camus has been rightly criticized for inconsistently holding to the absurdity of life on the one hand and to the ethics of human love and brotherhood on the other. The two are logically incompatible. As one philosopher has written, it is impossible to generate an ethic of brotherly love out of a philosophy of nihilism. Bertrand Russell, too, was inconsistent. For although he was an atheist, Russell was also an outspoken social critic, denouncing war and restrictions on sexual freedom. Russell admitted that he could not live as though moral values were simply the subjective expressions of personal taste, and that he therefore found his own views, and I quote, incredible. I do not know the solution, he confessed. The point is that if there is no God, then absolute right and wrong do not exist. As Dostoevsky said, all things are permitted. But Dostoevsky also showed that man cannot live this way. He shows this, for example, in his novel Crime and Punishment, in which a young atheist brutally murders an old woman, though he knows that on his presuppositions he should not feel guilty. Nevertheless, he is consumed with guilt until he finally confesses his crime and gives his life to God. In his masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky tells of how a man murders his father because his brother, Ivan, had told him that God does not exist, and therefore there are no moral absolutes. The man tells Ivan that it was really Ivan himself who murdered their father, since it was Ivan who said that moral absolutes are illusory. Unable to live with the logical consequences of his own system, Ivan suffers a mental collapse. Man cannot live as though moral values do not exist. He cannot live as though it's perfectly all right for soldiers to slaughter innocent children. He cannot live as though it's all right for dictatorial regimes to follow systematic programs of physical torture of political prisoners. He cannot live as though it's perfectly all right for dictators like Pol Pot or Slobodan Milosevic to ruthlessly commit ethnic cleansing and genocide against their own people. Everything in him cries out to say that these acts are wrong, really wrong. But if God does not exist, he cannot. And therefore, he makes a leap of faith and affirms values anyway. And when he does so, he reveals the inadequacy of a world without God. The horror of an atheistic universe was brought home to me powerfully a few years ago through a BBC television documentary called The Gathering. It featured interviews with survivors of the Holocaust who had regathered in Jerusalem to share their experiences and rediscover lost friendships. Now, I had visited concentration camps in Europe and had heard stories of the Holocaust before, and I thought I was beyond shocking by further tales of horror. But as I viewed these interviews, I found that I was not. One woman, for example, told of how she was incarcerated at Auschwitz and was forced, because she was a nurse, to become the gynecologist at Auschwitz. She noticed that Dr. Mengele housed all of the pregnant women together in a certain barracks, and some time passed and she no longer saw any of these women. She made inquiries. What happened to the women who were housed in that barracks? "Oh, haven't you heard?" came the reply. "Dr. Mengele used them for vivisection." A rabbi told the story of a woman at the camp who had a small infant. Dr. Mengele wanted to conduct experiments to see how long an infant could survive without nourishment. And so he had this woman's breasts bound up so that she couldn't suckle her baby. And every day the baby lost weight, which was eagerly monitored by Dr. Mengele. Desperately, this poor woman tried to keep the baby alive by feeding it bits of bread soaked in coffee, but all to no avail. Every day the baby lost weight, and each day Dr. Mengele weighed the baby to check its decline. Then a nurse came secretly to this woman and said, "I've brought a morphine injection for you to kill your baby, and you can get out of this place. I've arranged a way of escape for you, but you can't bring the baby with you." The woman protested. "I can't kill my own child." She said, "Look, the baby is going to die anyway. At least save yourself." And so this mother felt compelled to take the life of her own infant. My heart was torn as I heard these stories. The rabbi at Auschwitz said that it was as though there existed a world in which all of the 10 Commandments were reversed. Thou shalt lie, thou shalt kill, thou shalt steal. Mankind has never seen such a hell. And yet, in a real sense, if God does not exist, then our world is Auschwitz. There is no ultimate right and wrong. All things are permitted. But no atheist, no agnostic can live consistently and happily within the framework of such a worldview. Finally, let's look at the problem of purpose in life. The only way that most people who deny purpose in life manage to live happily is either by making up some purpose for their life, which amounts to self-delusion, as we saw with Sartre, or else by not carrying out their views to its logical conclusions. For example, take the problem of death. According to the psychologist Ernst Bloch, the only way modern man lives in the face of death is by subconsciously borrowing the belief in immortality which his forefathers held to, even though he himself has no basis for this belief, since he does not believe in God. Bloch concludes, thus this quite shallow courage feasts on a borrowed credit card. It lives from earlier hopes and the support they had once provided. But modern man no longer has any right to that support, since he rejects God. But in order to live purposefully in the face of death, he makes a leap of faith to affirm a reason for living. We often find the same inconsistency among those who say that man and the universe came to exist for no purpose, but just by chance. For example, feminists have raised a storm of protest over Freudian sexual psychology because they say it's chauvinistic and degrading to women. And some psychologists knuckled under and revised their theories. Now, this is totally inconsistent. If Freudian psychology is really true, then it doesn't matter if it's degrading to women. You can't change the truth because you don't like what it leads to. But people cannot live consistently and happily in a world in which other people are devalued. But if God does not exist, then nobody has any value. Only if God exists can one consistently support women's rights. For if God does not exist, then natural selection dictates that the male of the species is the dominant and aggressive one. Women would have no more rights than a female goat or a chicken has rights. In nature, whatever is right. But who can live with such a view? Apparently not even Freudian psychologists, who revise their theories when pushed to their logical conclusions. Or take the sociological behaviorism of a man like B.F. Skinner. This view leads to the sort of society envisioned by George Orwell in 1984, where the government controls and programs the thought of everybody. If Pavlov's dog can be made to salivate when a bell rings, then so can a human being. And if Skinner's theories are right, there can be no moral objection to treating people like the rats in Skinner's rat box as they run through their mazes, coaxed on by food and electric shocks. According to Skinner, all of our actions are programmed anyway, and if God does not exist, then no moral objection can be raised against this kind of programming, for man is not qualitatively different from a rat, for both are just the result of matter plus time plus chance. But again, who can live with such a dehumanizing worldview? Or finally, take the biological determinism of a man like Francis Crick. The logical conclusion is that man is like any other laboratory specimen. The world was horrified when it learned that at camps like Dachau, the Nazis had used prisoners for medical experiments on human beings. But why not? If God does not exist, there can be no objection to using people as human guinea pigs. A memorial at Dachau says, "Nie wieder," never again. But this sort of thing continued to go on. It was recently revealed that in the United States, after the war, various persons of minority group status were injected, unknown to them, with a sterilization drug by medical researchers. Mustn't we protest that this is wrong? That people are more than just electrochemical machines? The end of this view is population control, in which the weak and the unwanted are killed off to make room for the strong. But the only way we can consistently protest this view is if God exists. Only if God exists can there be purpose in life. And thus, as one modern writer has said, if God is dead, man is dead too. Man cannot live consistently and happily as though life were without meaning, value, and purpose. The finite world alone is insufficient to maintain a happy and consistent life.